Alrighty, it's 9, so we'll go ahead and get started. Today what we're gonna do is we have a few more slides. I've added some slides for some interactivities. I usually just like read off. I think that'll make it a little easier to process. Also have a few things I'm gonna do notes on the board for. So I'm gonna call attendance real quick. I'm already starting to be able to check off some of you just by looking around the rooms. My hope is next week I won't have to call attendance anymore. I'll just be able to check you off as you come in. All right, so Destiny, Diego, I know told me he couldn't be here today. Manny, I don't see. Maria? Oh, he's coming? All right, awesome. Thanks. Maria. Jasmine? Awesome. Dawn, Sammy, Rita, Jordan, Nyla, Kyle, Alexis, Joe, Sadie. Oh, Sadie is on Zoom. Taj, I saw. Here, I did not see. Nathan, Sebastian also emailed me he won't be able to be here today. Connor, Michelle, Chandler, Casey today. Brooklyn told me she might be late. And then Gabby. All right. Okie dokie. So today and Friday will be our last sort of like intro stuff. Next week, we're going to dive into the topics in more detail. There we go. Cannot click and talk at the same time. All right. So one quick thing I wanted to talk about is a couple of people have talked about how long the smart books are. I apologize, those are new activities this time around for me teaching, so I cannot change any of the ones at the beginning of the semester. It won't let me change things after people have already done them. But I went in for everyone, I believe, starting after next week, and I made them shorter, so hopefully that will help. I apologize. They're not meant to take like 4 hours, and I really am sorry. This is again like you just decide something that they say is going to be great, and then you realize, no, I'm torturing my students, and that was not my goal. So thank you for your patience, and they will get better, I promise. Alrighty, so we were talking about the experimental method and how we might do a study related to eating to look at this. So our big hypothesis is going to be that people who binge eat will be more likely to do so in response to negative moods than neutral moods. And so this is what our breakdown would look like. So we are going to use random assignment. Everyone who comes in to do the study would be equally likely to get assigned to the experimental group or the control group. So again, maybe we flip a coin when they come in, maybe we predetermine it with a random number generator. Either way, they have equal likelihood of being put into either group. All these people are going to be people that we have already identified as people who engage in binge eating. That's not something we can just like make someone start doing, right? So these will be people who self-identified as, yeah, I do this, I have this experience. The experimental group, we will induce depressed mood. The control group will do a similar activity to, again, try to keep all the conditions similar, but we're going to try to go for a neutral mood instead. We will then reassess their mood. We'll assess their mood when they first come in, and then we'll reassess it after the experimental manipulation. Make sure it actually worked. right? There are some people that sad statements just wouldn't make them feel sad. Some of these people, there's a whole host of reasons, different psychopathology. So for example, if you suffer from schizophrenia, your emotions might not match what most people would experience. Folks who are on the autism spectrum, same thing. Or to be honest, people who are psychopaths, right, don't experience emotions in the same way. So you kind of want to make sure this actually works for this person. And then, as I mentioned previously, we would actually have food out. People do this a couple different ways. Some people will just have standard foods out for everybody. So everybody has a bowl of chips, a bowl of popcorn, what have you. Some people will actually ask the person before they come in, what types of foods do you typically binge on? And then they'll have those foods present. So let's say for the sake of like trying to keep everything as constant as possible, we just have standard snacks that are, like look good to everybody. And we're gonna weigh them before people come in. We put out a standard amount for everybody. And then when they're done and they leave, we'll weigh them again. That'll determine how much they've eaten. Did they binge or not? So how do we manipulate depressed mood? Well, I've kind of talked about this in the abstract a couple times, but I wanted to show you all some examples of how we actually do this. So this is sort of an older method to do this. A lot of times now we would show a clip or play some music, but there are just cards with statements on them that are supposed to make folks feel a little yuckier. So today is neither better nor worse than any other day. However, I feel a little low today. Sometimes I wonder whether school is all that worthwhile. Every now and then I feel so tired and gloomy that I'd rather just sit than do anything. I can remember times when everybody but me seemed full of energy. I feel somewhat discouraged and drowsy. Maybe I'll need a nap when I get home. There have been days when I feel weak and confused and everything went miserably wrong. So you may have even noticed that as I read them, even though I've read those tons of times before, my voice got slower, right? And not quite as energetic. When you read stuff like that, it just is gonna start to affect you. The neutral statements, I mean, for lack of a better explanation, are just boring statements. They're factoids. Oklahoma City is the largest city in the world and area. Japan was elected to the United Nations almost 14 years after Pearl Harbor. At the end appears a section entitled Bibliography Notes. We have two kinds of nouns denoting physical things: individual and mass nouns. Agricultural products comprise 70% of the income. Saturn is sometimes in conjunction behind the sun from Earth and is not visible. Some streets were still said to be listed under the old names. So these, in theory, shouldn't make you feel positive or negative. They're just sort of like, okay, I'm reading a thing, right? I guess if you were like really into facts, this could create a positive mood, right? But for most people, it's like, all right, cool, I guess. And so just to remind us what this looks like, we have the people come in, we randomly assign them, we assess their mood. Usually this is done with a questionnaire. Again, you're either going to get the depressed or the neutral cards, and then you'll reassess the mood and then assess the food intake. The results of studies like these are typically that you actually do see, and let me back up real quick, you do see a difference in that the people who are in the group where depressed mood was induced actually do eat more than the people who were in the neutral group. And there's a couple different reasons for this. One is some people use binge eating to cope. Another is just that depressed mood might sort of biochemically actually stimulate something for us. And so there's a lot of things that go on there. So you'll recall that with experiments, we can draw conclusions regarding cause and effect. Thus, in those scenarios where the experimental group eats more than the neutral group, we can say we cause that by putting them in this depressed mood by reading the statements. And again, ethically, we're going to talk a little bit more about ethics today in research. You also need to undo that. So at the end, you would have them either read positive statements or do something else to like bring them out of that depressed funk. You can expand the experimental method just as you can other methods. So there are several different ways that we can get around not always having a perfect experiment. Quasi-experiments involve examining differences that may already exist in groups without random assignment. So can anyone think of something that we could not randomly assign someone to? Yeah, biological. Were you adopted or not? Right? We're not going to like randomly assign you or who your parents were. Something like gender, right? We can't randomly assign someone. Race, we can't randomly assign someone. Also, bad experiences, right? We would never want to randomly assign someone to be abused, but we could study the difference between people who were abused as children and people who were not, right? What you do is you get matched subjects, you get people who are like your control or your experimental group, your quasi-experimental group. So for example, let's say you wanted to study the difference between people who've been abused, people who weren't. And all your people who had experience of abuse were middle class, mixed race, right? You would want to get a control group that was also middle class, mixed race, right? And then you can compare the two. Natural experiments occur when nature itself or a larger person-made phenomenon manipulates the independent variable. So today's September 11th. I don't know that I've ever had this fall directly on September 11th, but this is actually a picture from September 11th, 2011 of a citizen in New York City with the wreckage of the two towers behind her. Again, we would never want to create a natural disaster, right? There's a hurricane about to hit Louisiana. We would never want to be like, let's make a fake hurricane and see what happens. We would never want to create a terrorist attack to see what happens. But what we can do in the wake of such things is figure out what's actually helpful so we can replicate that in the future. So in the wake of September 11th, 2001, it was of great interest and clinical concern to examine the effects of experiencing these attacks on those who witnessed the attacks, like this woman, those who might have had loved ones who perished in the attacks. And they studied predictors of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, effectiveness of therapy for those who were influenced by the attacks. They even studied things like, okay, the first responders and the Red Cross workers, what happened to them? And for example, there was a study that showed that Red Cross workers had higher rates of alcoholism than people who were not at the site. And how can we help those folks? And again, we're not trying to exploit, right, those things. What we're trying to do is help the people who are there and who experienced it. And the ideal, the hope is that for future disasters, we can take what we learned and help people that much more quickly. So for example, a grad school classmate of mine, when the earthquake and the nuclear meltdown happened in Japan several years back, he was flown out as sort of a mental health first responder. And a lot of what he implemented was based on what we learned through our research following September 11th. And obviously similar research on things like Katrina and the fallout there. So again, never want to create this, but in the wake of these things, we can learn things for science that will hopefully help in the future. Analog experiments involve using animals in the lab to try to replicate or simulate things we can see in humans. This is controversial for sure. There are some people who say we should never examine animals. There are some people who will say like some animal research is okay, but others isn't. So there's some animal research that like does not harm animals at all. For example, there was a famous cognitive psychologist named Irene Pepperberg who trained a African gray parrot up to the level that he showed the intelligence of like a 4 or 5-year-old human. He could tell you the color of something, he could add, he had a concept of 0, right? Alex was not being harmed in any way, he actually enjoyed it because he got nuts when he like did something well, right? So some people are like, well, that's okay. And some people are like, no, don't do any of it. You know, our neighbors at PETA, right in downtown Norfolk, would probably be on that side, right? And then some people say, who cares? We should do whatever it takes to help humans. You know, I don't really have a side on this. It's just something to kind of think about in the abstract. Obviously, for a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about this semester, we're talking about like personality, right? And we're talking about therapy. Animal models aren't really going to help with that too much, right? But there are certainly things within biopsychology, cognitive psychology, where animal models can be really helpful. The only animal research I personally have supervised is I have a now alum who, for her capstone 480 project, which is where you do your own original research project, studied social learning in stingrays. So she actually got some stingrays. She taught half of them to do a task. And so stingrays have this natural instinct where the way they get their food is they suck it out of the ground. And so she put it in a tube and they had to suck it out of the tube. And then what she would do is take a stingray that hadn't been taught that, put it in the tank with the stingray that had been taught it, see what happened. And the stingray that hadn't been taught it learned by watching the other stingray, which is really cool. That's not something that we'd seen before. Unfortunately, she had like one stingray that got sick and didn't kind of cooperate because they were sick. And so it wasn't publishable, but otherwise it would have been. And that like really informed her career. She now works at the Georgia Aquarium. She's worked with the dolphins in the past, and now she works with the pinnipeds, which are the seals and sea lions. So we actually got to visit with her over the summer and meet a nearly 700-pound sea lion, which was kind of fun. But just to show you that, again, like her stingrays weren't harmed. I believe like they were going to go to ODU and participate in a study there, and then they were going to donate them to the aquarium and they'd be in the touch tank. So there are ways that you can do this without having to like harm the animals in any way. That being said, there are some crazy things psychologists do, I should say, before we dive into this slide, like where they will actually put electrodes in a rat's brain and have it run a maze with like something sticking out of its head. But this is how we learn about basic neuronal things. So I don't know. I'll just tell you a quick story where one time when I was in grad school, we got a department-wide email and they said, if you see a white rat, we don't have an infestation. They were going to euthanize it and it got away. And all the clinical people were like, go rat, go. So our own little thing. Alrighty, so you can also kind of combine the case study and the experimental technique with one individual. And these are called single case or single person experiments. And so they have been used to develop and test therapy techniques in particular, but also other things where you can only kind of study it with one person. So you study the same person over time, and you're going to compare their behavior at a later time after you introduce some sort of intervention or treatment. And again, you're going to do this when that person couldn't be part of a larger study. There's something that precludes that. The most common design for a single case experiment is the ABAB design, and those just stand for different phases of the study. So the first A is before you do anything, the baseline. You would measure things as they were already existing. How's it going? The first B, you're going to introduce your independent variable. Whatever you think is going to help that person, you introduce it. Hopefully that person will change in positive ways. But because you only have one person, it's hard to say this caused that, right? So what you do to kind of double check it is you'll take away that independent variable and measure again. And then you reintroduce it and hey, it's working, we can keep doing it. This is so abstract and it can be really hard to kind of wrap your head around it. And so I have an example that hopefully will be more helpful to y'all. And again, if you're writing everything down, just a reminder that these slides are all on Blackboard. So this is the case of Chris, and Chris was a 19-year-old female with severe developmental delays. So she was operating not on the level of someone who was 19, maybe more someone 10 years younger. And she, since the age of 3, had a disorder called trichotillomania. Not a term you need to know, but just to tell you what it is an impulse control or obsessive compulsive disorder where you pull your hair out. And sometimes you don't even realize you're doing it. So people will have it so bad, and in fact, Chris had it so bad that she had bald spots on her scalp. I have had a student who had this, and one day she came in with just like half her eyebrow gone, and I was like, okay, what's going on? Right, because that was an indicator she'd been pretty darn stressed. And that night she was having like a crisis about what her career should be when she grew up. So, great, let's talk. And so because Chris was developmentally delayed, we have a problem applying most therapies. Most therapies are developed for adults, and they expect you to be at least at a sort of high school level. A lot of them, to be perfectly honest, are at like a college level of intellect, because people who are really smart academics came up with them. That was not going to work with Chris. She wasn't going to be able to engage with that, right? And so they had to be creative. And so what they did is they found out she was most likely to do her hair pulling while she watched TV. So with her consent and her guardian's consent, they set up a camera while she was watching TV and looked at the percentage of time she spent pulling her hair. And this is not my case, this is a case that I saw reported. I personally think that probably they tried a whole bunch of stuff that didn't work. Because if you look at how long this baseline is, right? They were like, okay, let's see what happens. And sometimes they got it to go to 0, but then it went back up, right? And so they were trying to figure out what's a way we can help her. And then they came up with the idea of something really simple. Let's take a 2.5-pound wrist weight, those things that you kind of Velcro around your wrist, right? And put one on each of her arms. Then when she moves her hand, she's more aware of it. And then she realizes, oh, I was about to pull my hair. I don't want to do that. And so they tried that. Hey, it went down to 0. Sweet. But as I mentioned, there were a couple times it's been down to 0 before, but then it bounced back. So they were like, okay, we need to see what happens if we do it without the weights on her wrists. So they took them off, had her watch TV, and she returned to basically like her average 60 to 70% of the time she was watching TV, she was pulling her hair. Then they reinstated them. It went away again because she was aware of her arms moving. So the weight was found to be effective in stopping Chris's self-destructive hair pulling behavior. Pretty darn cool. Sometimes psychology is best done by the simplest method. And this is just a little joke about pessimism versus optimism in research methods. Alrighty, so now I want to talk about a couple things that your book talks about related to research that are important to know, kind of in the abstract. So one is what happens once you've collected your data, right? We've talked about doing experiments, we've talked about doing correlational studies. you're gonna end up with a whole bunch of numbers from those, right? It's numbers on the questionnaire, it's number of ounces of food that they ate, right? What do you do when you have a spreadsheet of all these numbers staring back at you, right? And so we use statistics in order to analyze these. I was always someone who was good at math. I was in like AP math classes in high school, but I did not like it. Whenever I had to do math homework, it was not enjoyable to me. It just felt like a drag. And this is nothing against math. It was just sort of my personal experience. When I got to college and took a statistics class, I was like, oh, this is why we do math. And it became much more real for me, and I understood how applicable it was. And so some people will get intimidated by statistics. I encourage you to kind of think of them in terms of making meaning out of all this stuff we get. So one of the things that we look at are measures of central tendency. These are a type of statistic called descriptive statistics. And it's exactly what it sounds like. They are going to describe the data that we collected. And you don't want to do this by, again, if we think about our experiment, we had 50 people in each group, right? We don't want to have 100 points of data that we're trying to summarize just abstractly. So statistics help with this. Some of the stuff y'all have learned before, I'm sure. One of the things we look at is measures of central tendency. So essentially, when we summarize all this data we've got, what's kind of happening in the middle of it, or the average of it. So it looks at the overall characteristics of the data. The mean is just the average of your data. You just add up all the scores and divide them by the number of scores. So we had 100 scores. Well, actually, we probably want to compare the two, right? So 50 in each group. You add up this 50 and divide by 50. You add up this 50 and divide by 50. And those are the means for each group on, let's say, ounces of food consumed, right? And what we would find in that study is that more food was consumed by those people we induced the press meat in. So the mean is just the average. The median is the scores that fall directly in the center of the data set after you arrange them from highest to lowest, or vice versa. It's the middle score. So if you have 101 people, right, it's your 51st one in the middle. If you have 100 people, it's basically between your 49th and 50th person. Pretty simple. Tells you a little bit about the data, not quite as much as the mean. For some reason, people in like economics love to talk about the median for things. Like you'll hear people be like the median household income. And I'm not really sure why that is, to be honest. We kind of rarely use median in psychology. We're mostly talking about the mean. Sometimes we're talking about the mode. So the mode is the number that occurs most frequently in our data set. So again, thinking about our binge eaters who are consuming ounces of food, you know, if 20 of the 50 ate, I don't know, 10 ounces of food, that's our mode. Just the thing that happened the most often. If I give y'all a test and 13 of you get an 85, and then we've got some people who get in the 90s, some people get in the 70s. That 85 is our mode because it's the most common score y'all scored. It will depend on what your data set looks like, how much those things relate to each other. So if you have a perfect normal curve where you got like a few people low, a few people high, most people in the middle, then your mean, median, and mode might actually be the same thing. If the data is what we call skewed, and skewed just means it tends to go one way or the other, then what we'll see is those might be more spaced out, right? Our mode is still the most commonly occurring number, Our median is gonna be in the middle, but then our mean, because we've got so many people up here, is gonna go away from that mode. This is a nice little diagram of what the mean, median, and mode are and how you calculate them. So again, for the mean, you're just gonna take all your numbers and add them up, and then divide by the number of data points. So in this case, there are 11 numbers. You add them up, you get 73. You divide that, 6.64. One of the things they point out is that it's rounded to 2 decimal places. That's pretty common in science in general, but in psychology in particular, where you don't report all the decimal places, you usually round to 2. Again, the median is that middle number. You just line them up from smallest to greatest. Find the number in the middle. And then your mode is that most commonly occurring number, most frequently occurring number. In this case, it's 5. One thing I didn't mention on the previous slide that we also look at here is range. Range is just what's your lowest number to what's your biggest number in that particular data set, right? So like if we think about our binge eaters, maybe in the neutral mood group, there was someone who didn't eat anything. They weren't hungry. They said, oh, nothing. So 0 ounces. Maybe in the depressed group, there was someone who was really hungry and they ate, I don't know, 50 ounces worth of food, right? That's our range, 0 to 50. And you can get it by subtracting like how many numbers are in between. Another measure of the overall data set and how much it varies is standard deviation. I'll put that up here for y'all. This is a more complex calculation, not something I'm going to make y'all calculate, but basically it tells you the average of how much scores vary around the mean. So how close on average are those numbers to the mean, right? And if you have a low standard deviation, that means most of the numbers are right around the mean. If you have a higher standard deviation, that means you've got a lot more variability, right? Give you some examples here. So typically when I do my research, I'm working with y'all, college age students, often intro students, right? Who take part in studies for class or extra credit. My standard deviation for age in those studies is really small, right? Because most of y'all are like 18 to 22-ish. Maybe we've got a few students continuing on who might be in their 30s or something like that, but are still pretty small standard deviations. When I collect data online, I'll get people who are 18, but I also get like grandmas who are 73, right? And so my standard deviation for age is much, much bigger because I've got a lot more variation in the ages. And that can really happen with any data. The other thing that we use in psychology, again, nothing I'm going to make you like calculate, is what's called inferential statistics. And these are statistics we use to actually look at differences between groups, relationships between variables, so that correlation coefficient we talked about when we talked about correlations, that is an inferential statistic. And then they determine essentially what is the likelihood that this relationship was found on accident, that just happened because of chance. And so one of the things you'll see always reported with inferential statistics is your p-value. And p just means probability. And typically you'll see it reported as p is less than 0.05. Statistically, that just means there's a 5% chance this happened on accident. That means there's a 95% chance this relationship, this correlation, this difference between the two means, whatever inferential statistic we're looking at, happened on purpose. It's real. Now, why 5%? It's arbitrary, to be perfectly honest. It's something that someone decided a long time ago and we've just sort of stuck with it. Some people will report 0.01, so there's only a 1% chance that this happened. Some people will report 0.001, so then there's a 0.1% chance this happened by chance. Again, sometimes stuff in science, just somebody came up with a rule a while ago and we just roll with it. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is thinking about our experiments and the concept of independent variables and dependent variables. Just a couple examples that I was going to have us work through together. So the first one, people are coming in to be part of a sleep study. And most of the time people do this to be diagnosed with issues for their health. But you can use this as an experimental method. And the study is looking at whether the number of hours a person gets of sleep determines how well they'll do on an exam. And they randomly assign them to either the tech would come in and wake them up several times throughout the night, or they just let them sleep as usual. Alrighty, so thinking about this, what would be the independent variable? What are they manipulating here? Yeah, how many hours of sleep they got, right? And then what is the dependent variable? What are they trying to determine is affected by that or not? Yeah, exactly. Their scores on the exam. Right? All right. So which is the experimental group, do we think? The people who got woken up or the people who were allowed to sleep? Who thinks it's people who got woken up? Y'all are right. It's the people who got woken up. And the control group is the people we don't manipulate, right? So they're the people who sleep through the night. Awesome, cool. All right, here's another one. They took part in a study to determine the number of consumed beers it would take to affect their ability to walk in a straight line. And so you might be like, what? But this is actually a type of study that people do. So actually, I think it's Virginia Tech does a lot of research on like alcohol impairment. Very interesting stuff. So what's your independent variable here?
Is it the number of beers?
Exactly, number of beers, right? And then what would be your dependent variable? Yeah, it's your ability to walk the line, right? And here, this one, the experimental and the control group are not as clearly outlined, right? Is it that the experimental group is getting 10 beers and the control group is getting 5? Is it that, you know, they have like a threshold they estimated and people go above it? Or is it that a control group is getting no beers? It's not clear. We would need more information, right? And this is why when you write a scientific paper or do a scientific presentation, you want to be crystal clear on your method so people understood what you did. Alrighty, pharmaceutical company X conducted an experiment to determine if a new migraine headache pill would actually alleviate migraine headaches. Pretty straightforward. All right, so what's the independent variable here? Yeah. It would, so the migraine headaches is going to be our DV, but it would be the medication, right? So probably in this case, you would get one experimental group gets the medicine, control groups gets a placebo, right? And again, that's not really clear. You would have to ask more questions. Was there a control group? Hopefully there was, otherwise this is not a very good experiment, right? So the experimental group would get the meds, the control group will get the placebo. All right, last one for this activity. So College X conducted an experiment to determine if freshmen that had their schedules made for them did better in their freshman year, I'm guessing GPA wise, than freshmen that made their own schedules. So, which is the independent variable here? Exactly, whether their schedule was made for them or not. And then what's our dependent variable? Exactly, how good they do, again, probably measured by something like GPA. And so this one, it's like a little trickier because you'd have to know what the norm is, right? Most colleges, you let the first years, the freshmen, make their own schedules, so they would be your control group. And your experimental group would be someone else who makes it. How are they doing it for y'all now? Do you come in and they have your schedule made up, or do you get to pick classes?
Good list, I'm sure like that.
Okay, that's nice. Yeah, for a couple years they were doing it where they just like handed people schedules. And as you can imagine, that was like a hot mess sometimes. People were putting classes they didn't need to take. Anyway, yeah, and so then you would see, does this make a difference? Do they do better? Whether they take classes they want versus classes you say they should take. All right, so before we get into this one, and you can start reading it if you want, I'm just gonna cover a couple quick things from ethics that we should know. I mean, the biggest one is that you want to be ethical as a psychologist, right? It sounds stupid to say it out loud. But the consideration of ethical standards in general came about after they discovered not only the atrocities that are well known when they invaded the concentration camps after World War II, but also that Nazi doctors were using prisoners as guinea pigs in their experiments. These were largely medical experiments. They would do vivisections, which are like live dissections. They would do all kinds of crazy things to people. And as part of a larger conversation around maybe we should try to make sure this never happens again, they had this in place. Within psychology, when we talk about our social psychology chapter, some of this stuff will come up. There have been some really bad examples of experiments in psychology's history, where the people who were in the study were harmed. And so within the field of psychology, we've really made an effort to try to protect the people who participate in our studies. We do this for a couple different ways. One is just like professionally, we're trained in how to do research ethically, how to like do therapy ethically if you're going to do therapy. But then there's also a standard set of guidelines for our profession called the APA, American Psychological Association Ethics Code. Yeah, it's awful. I'm sorry. I hate that noise. And so for research in particular, there's a couple things this outlines. So everybody who participates in research must have what's called informed consent. They should know generally what they're gonna do in the study. They should know about how long that study is gonna take them. They should know what, if any, compensation they're gonna get for participating in that study. We also want to ensure confidentiality. So if I get some really personal data about one of you, I can't go skipping down the hall and be like, guess what I found out about this person, right? And in fact, for this reason, most researchers don't even look at individual data points. They only analyze as a group to try to protect participants. You also have to debrief the participants afterwards. This means you have to explain to them what you were actually doing in the study and why you're doing it. This is often, if you do an in-person study, a sheet of paper they hand you at the end. If you're doing it online, it's often the last page of the survey. This will include things like how to contact the counseling center if something distressed you. It will include things like whether or not deception was used. In some cases, you will try to hide the reason you're doing this study to try to get like a genuine reaction from people. Give an example, a classic study in my subfield looking at body image. They told people they were coming in for a consumer study to rate clothing. They had them try on either a swimsuit or a sweater. And then they're like, oh, by the way, while you have that on, can you fill out these questionnaires about body image and also do some math problems? And then afterwards they revealed like that was the actual thing. They were trying to see if sitting in a swimsuit to fill out these questionnaires would affect how much you could concentrate and how you felt about your body. So that becomes, these all become really important things. Is that so that we can protect our participants, practice ethically. But yeah, let's start with this example. It's very long, so if you haven't had a chance to read this whole thing, you've got two psych majors, and one of them says, I don't know why Dr. Myers is even like teaching this whole lecture on statistics and research methods. I'm not gonna use them. I'm just gonna be a counselor. Science is just treating everybody like they're cookie cutter, and I think we'd be better if we didn't look at them that way. And I've had students say this to me before. Oh, you're looking at people as if they're test tubes. That's unethical in and of itself. Bethany says, psychologists have learned so much about human behavior using the scientific method. I really believe that if you can figure out all the factors that affecting someone's behavior, you can essentially help them better. And she wants to be a researcher because she can help more people in the long run. As a researcher, I can develop programs that will help a lot of people. So thinking about this, who do you think is more right? Or is there a more right person? Should we be looking at people through the lens of research, or should we be ignoring research altogether? Or maybe somewhere in the middle, as you can kind of guess. That's probably where we should end up. Yeah, so as the second question kind of alludes to, we don't want to take either of these to the extreme, right? We don't want to go pure put counseling in isolation and not informed by science. We don't want to go pure put research in isolation and not like think about the people we're working with, right? We want to do something in between. And this is actually a model that I was trained in. So my PhD in clinical psychology is from Kent State University, and they use a model called the clinical scientist model. And that means we are teaching you how to be a clinician, but we're teaching you to do it with science in mind when you're sitting across from that person. So we were taught treatments that have research behind them that show they actually help. We were taught how to implement that when you're in that room with your therapy client, and kind of the reflexive nature of those things. Oh God, this ended up weird. I'm gonna skip this one real quick. These all ended up weird. This is not what it looked like. Okay, but let's do this one. As part of their class requirements, the students in a research design and analysis class are sent over to the mall to observe interactions between moms and toddlers. They're told not to interact, but just to record certain behaviors like the number of time the mom speaks harshly or the number of times the kid whines or cries. One of the mother notices and complains to the mall security. The manager of the mall asks the students, what are they doing? And then writes a letter to Dr. Taylor that says, I'm requesting you don't engage in any more observational research at our mall. I don't think it's right to allow students to observe people's behavior without getting their permission first. It's a violation of privacy. It's wrong if they don't realize they're being watched. So, what do you all think? Naturalistic observation is one of the things your book talks about as a way to do research. How would you all feel if you realized somebody was watching you from a psychology class, right? It's actually something y'all are gonna do later in the semester, but not with, like, at a mall with parents. Right, so this is something to think about, right? So how do we do good psychology ethically, right? So a lot of psychologists would say this is fine ethically because they're not taking down identifying information, they're not interfering, they're just observing things as they happen in nature. Whereas the manager and the mother's concerns are justified. I don't want someone just watching me, right? If I don't know that they're doing it. So it's something to kind of think about as we go forward, is how invasive are these things for the people who are participating? And where is that ethical line? Already on Friday, y'all are going to do an experiment. So looking forward to that. I'm ready to do some science.
I open this. Like, McRae book, it's like it's.
Okay, shoot me an email and I'll look into it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
It's so good. I'll take it all in. It's so good. It'll be like early in like 5 minutes. Oh. We're actually doing this. Really? Wait, you're going to or you should? You're going to. I think it's a good idea. We need a bond. Although, it's just, it's really hard in season. My freshman year, we did them early in the spring. We just need like once a week to go and have good ones. Yeah. We do ours with our coaches too, which is a lot sometimes. Some coaches prefer to do like in-person meetings, but like they also have units and whatever.
Yeah.
So like, you know. It's not fair.
I would do it no.
We had like 15 coaches. They're both about it. For me, then. Yeah, you betcha. Well, when you guys said there was one, you didn't $3, I already gave you one of those one. I canceled it, I was like, let me look on eBay, and it was $3. Yeah. And I was like, alright. That is much better. But it's a lot of good. Sometimes we just need, it's just hard to do it without spending a lot of money. Yeah, we were like, we could just like hang out and watch movies. Yeah. You know. This hard, like this, you want to see things over the single person. And it'll also be easier for some people. Yeah. We had like basic notes, so we did basic. That's nice. See, we don't do that. We don't do that. Way.
Nope, I would hope I grabbed my butt.